Well, I'm delighted to have the chance to talk to you a little bit about some of the major changes that happened in voting during the 1960s and the 1970s. And the story I'm going to tell today and we're going to look at on the maps is a story that's concentrated in the South, especially the Deep South. It's a story about the mobilization of African Americans through a unique social movement, the civil rights movement, which most of you are familiar with, the resulting legislation, especially the Voting Rights Act that came out of that movement, and then the truly remarkable degree to which African Americans took advantage of that legislation. The federal government enforced that act so that blacks could begin voting, in many instances for the first time in the Deep South. And our story ends not only with a lot of African Americans voting in the South, it ends with a major shift in the allegiance of white Southerners who had always been, or at least going back 100 years, had been tied to the Democratic Party, even though it was a party that represented often more liberal views, shifting to a party that was much more consonant with their views, and that was the Republican Party and the emergence of the Ronald Reagan conservatives by the 1980s. So let me take you through each stage of this. I'm not going to talk much about the civil rights movement. You know about Martin Luther King, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the remarkable heroism of thousands, tens of thousands of people on the ground in small places like Albany, Georgia, Selma, Alabama. This movement and the courage of those who were involved in it resulted in, for my money, the most important piece of legislation in the 20th century. That was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And the Voting Rights Act, although they didn't have fancy technology like this, was geared directly to participation. In fact, what triggered federal presence and oversight of elections were two things. One was a literacy test, and two was the percentage of registered voters being under 50%. That was really a stand-in for something. That was really a stand-in for denying the right of African Americans to vote. So the first map that I'd like to look at here, and it's up right now, is a map that shows you the voter participation, the voter turnout in the South. And you can see in the northern parts, I feel kind of like a weather person here, a cold front coming in from the north. You can see in the northern parts that it's very dark, and you can see in the South, especially the Deep South, especially Alabama, especially Mississippi, you can see how almost transparent this is. Very little purple on this map. And that is because very few African Americans could vote in the Deep South. In Mississippi, as late as 1964, only 7% of the eligible African Americans were registered to vote. In Alabama, it was higher, 23%, but still much lower and below that 50% threshold. Okay, the Voting Rights Act is passed. And again, this is a remarkable episode in American history. Within 4 years, it has a dramatic impact. To go back to those two states, in Mississippi, 60% of the eligible African Americans were registered by 1968, a mere 3 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. In Alabama, 53% of the eligible African Americans. And if we go to our maps and we take a look at 1972, you can see the significant darkening, especially in many of the Black Belt areas in the South. So African Americans are becoming a voting presence in the South because of the Voting Rights Act and because of the power of the civil rights movement, that social movement that really got this whole thing started. But as all you historians know, every action has a reaction, if not many reactions. And white Southerners reacted quite forcefully to the mobilization of the black vote. We're going to clear this map, and if we look at party strength. And let's go back to our our baseline here, 1956. If we look at party strength in the South, especially the Deep South, we're going to see a sea of blue. Now, I want you to remember the presidential candidate was this guy, Adlai Stevenson. You couldn't find somebody more liberal than him. He did not agree with many of the views of white Southerners. Nonetheless, they were loyal Democrats, and they were going to vote for the Democratic candidate. In 1952, Stevenson got 64% of the vote in Alabama, compared to 35% for a popular war hero, Eisenhower. That's the power of that partisan attachment. Well, as blacks begin to mobilize and begin to vote in the presidential elections, whites begin to react. We can see precursors of this in 1964 when Barry Goldwater ran as the Republican candidate. Goldwater advocated a states' rights position, and of course states' rights was very consonant with the views of many white Southerners who felt that states had the right to decide their own racial affairs. And you can see the really thinning out of all of that blue. It was a slightly different story in 1968, and you'll see that our map makers have put this guy George Wallace on here. And that's because, and you can see the density of the yellow here, that's because George Wallace received more votes than the Democratic candidate, Hubert Humphrey, in many instances in the Deep South in 1968. And then finally, let's just jump up to 1980 and look at the Republican Party and how intensely red many of these areas are becoming in the Deep South. And that process continues onwards. What happened? What we witnessed was the mass transformation of the partisan allegiances of Southerners, moving in the course of 30, 35 years from diehard Democrats, even when the candidate like Stevenson was far more liberal than their views on many things, to Ronald Reagan, moving, as often happens in American history, and I'm sure you've noticed this from other maps from other periods, often moving through third parties. Wallace ran on a third party ticket, and then finally making that ultimate jump, actually switching parties on a pretty permanent basis. And so today, when you go to watch the presidential elections, you can expect to see the Deep South be a pretty red map there, because a vast majority of white Southerners have shifted their allegiance from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. Of course, that's not the end of the story. We have to remember that African Americans are now voting in equal numbers. Just to give you an example, sticking with Alabama and Mississippi, in Alabama in 1965, 20% of African Americans were registered to vote. In 1988, that number was 68% were registered to vote. This is the impact of the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act. In Mississippi, remember, they started at 7% of the eligible African Americans who had registered to vote in 1965. By 1988, 75% of African Americans were registered to vote. Those African Americans tend to vote heavily for the Democratic Party. So what we've seen, especially with the rise of the black vote, is the possibility of some Democratic officials being elected from the South. Nonetheless, when it comes to presidential elections, that kind of winner-take-all process of the Electoral College, what we're left with is a sea of red these days in the Deep South.